Thank you to everyone joining us today for this very special event. Welcome. My name is Nick Posford, and I'm lucky to be the Executive Director of the UK Evaluation Society. We are the UK's largest cross-sector membership organisation for people working in or with evaluation. We provide training to support the growth and expertise of all who commission, design and deliver evaluation. Our members have access to networking opportunities to build meaningful connections and develop professionally, whether it is in exclusive member events, at our annual conference, in our training courses, or through our free event series. We love the insights, learning and exploration that come from getting people to discuss new and innovative approaches. From these seeds can grow whole new ways of doing or thinking about evaluation. An important way in which we drive innovation and education is our annual conference. And next year we will be in Sheffield in May, exploring how we make sure evaluation leads to real world change. That's the central question of our 2026 conference, Bridging the Gap, Evaluation to Action. Across 3 themes, we'll explore how evaluation can shape decisions, build cultures of learning, and communicate findings in ways that inspire action. The call for abstracts is now open, and significant savings are available on a limited number of super early bird tickets. Submit your proposal, get your ticket, and join us in Sheffield, where we will have more fascinating discussions like today's mini conference. A couple of housekeeping notes. We have muted your microphones whilst we have presentations, but when we move into small breakout groups, please unmute yourself so you can discuss what you think. We will be recording the main sessions and presentations, and these will be available a week or so after the event. We have scheduled a short break midway through the afternoon for a cup of tea or a comfort break. We also have a Padlet board for the event, which has information on today's speakers and presentations, and where anyone can submit resources that can support people's learning and application of relational evaluation concepts, principles and techniques. This could be toolkits and guidance, blog posts, articles, training materials, reports, etc. Please do make use of it. Thanks also to Hayley for supporting us with that. And I also have to thank Rick Davis, who presented the webinar for us, where he invited Nick Andrews to speak. And I was so fascinated by what Nick had to say that I asked him for a follow-up event. And then Nick drew in the amazing array of speakers we will hear from today. Massive thanks in particular to our partner, PERU at Manchester University, who have speakers talking today that have been setting the pace even within the last few months, hosting events exploring relational approaches. All our speakers have given up significant time to meet and discuss today's event over the last year, and the process of preparing the event has been both fascinating and a genuine joy to be involved with. I have had my mind open to all the possibilities that exist with these methods and approaches. I think sometimes the world can seem broken and that public services reflect that brokenness, but today's event will prove that there are ways of evaluating and reflecting that put compassion, care, inclusivity and people at the centre of evaluation, that it can be done with a heart as much as the head. There may be some sceptics, either online now or within the evaluation sector, and all I would say is be open-minded and allow yourselves to be challenged, which I generally find that evaluators are very good at, reflective practice being intrinsic to evaluation. The UK Evaluation Society is always looking to share innovative and challenging ideas. We will never stop sharing best practice and well-tried and tested methods, but we will also provide a platform to keep pushing evaluation forward, because ultimately we all want evaluation that matters, that makes positive change happen. And I suggest that today's event gives us one way of doing so. Enjoy.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to do a bit of an introduction. It's only a couple of minutes and I'm going to hand over to Peter. But building on what Nick said, the world is a rather unkind place right now, isn't it? And this can be reflected in organisational management, particularly in public services, in what Malcolm Patterson and his colleagues refer to as a culture of perform or perish, rather than one of relational and responsive. And in a similar vein, the neuroscientist and philosopher Ian McGilchrist, he suggests that the prevailing metaphor of the world at the moment, dominated by left hemisphere thinking, is that of machine. Everything is something to be managed and manipulated. rather than that of a metaphor of a garden, something to be nurtured and tended, really. And this can be reflected in certain approaches to evaluation that are detached, impersonal, and perhaps so-called objective. But what I'd like to share just now is a quote by Julia Unwin, who used to be the Chief Executive Officer of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And it's from a report she wrote on kindness in public policy, really, for the Carnegie Trust UK. So here goes. Public policy is about relationships, and it's about emotions. It's about how we love and how we care. It's about where we live and where we feel we belong. It's about how we change and grow. It's always and at all times about emotions. And yet talking about emotions in public policy is embarrassing and uncomfortable. So with that in mind, really, one focus for today is how we might shift that metaphor from machine to garden, and what role evaluation can play in supporting that transformation. Thank you. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Nick, and hello, everybody. It's great to be here. I want to start by saying that these are undoubtedly, as you've just been hearing, difficult times globally. We've been ruled now for nigh on half a century by an ideology, neoliberalism, which has challenged human commitments to support and care for each other, to take care of our planet, to advance knowledge and truth, and to value justice and fairness. There's more need now than ever for all efforts to make sense of and challenge this direction of travel. Sometimes it can feel like there's no end in sight. To be truthful, I wonder if one of the reasons for the massive response this event's gained are those concerns and desires for something different. Yes, these are difficult times, but that's only part of the story. What we've also been seeing over the same period has been another global development in a very different direction. I'm, of course, talking about the new social movements based on identity, social concern, and a commitment to inclusion and equality, which has been transforming our personal politics, our roles and relations with each other. There's no denying the power that these movements have shown and the positive changes they've led to. And perhaps that's another reason for the current desperate efforts of populist politics to derail them. This event's important because we're concerned with knowledge, development. We're part of something timely and much bigger, the search for knowledge and understanding that involves values and connects us, rather than which seeks to put barriers and hate between us. This is an important occasion, I believe, for that reason, and I hope that we're all able to add to the sum and feel able to add to the sum of inclusive understanding, our own and other people's, through our focus on relational inquiry. We've got a great space and a great opportunity this afternoon, working together. Every good wish for it. Thanks very much.
I'm Hannah, and I'm here with my colleague Rob Wilson, and we are members of the Policy Evaluation and Research Unit at Manchester Metropolitan University. And my plan is to share some of our inspirations for relational evaluation, attending in particular to the concept part of today's event on concept to practice, but also a bit about how it shows up in public service practice. In Peru, we run a master's in public administration and an MSc in policy, in evaluation and policy analysis. And as we're continuously reviewing them and sort of trying to think about how these ideas about relationality might offer something different to those programmes, we're taking inspiration from conversations like today and from conversations amongst the participatory and developmental evaluation community and conversations that happen at our TRIP conferences in the summer. I'm really keen to have your views today on some of these ideas. So I outline my construction of, so far, of the concept of the relational. And I should say now that I see relational evaluation not as a different methodology or an approach, albeit it might preference many methodologies more than others I can't go into today, but rather it's a different position and purpose for evaluation based on relational philosophical underpinnings. So my own journey of evaluation started 25 years ago in medical education, where complexity was rife and poorly engaged with in research and evaluation terms. And it was difficult for me to sort of join up my own learning about public service because of all those disjointed short-term contracts and things done on a project and programme basis. Then when I met people like Rob and colleagues Toby Lowe and Mark Smith, who are leaders in the field of public service reform, I was able to kind of connect my frustrations about evaluation in public services with a discourse in performance management. And I've thought more about this stuff through the development of human learning systems, which is a relational approach to public management that embraces human flourishing and continuous learning, through which outcomes emerge and are not delivered. This offers public managers an alternative to the neoliberal position of new public management as our mode of organising public service. But what I now realise I was sort of experiencing as an evaluator, and what I was noticing about how commissioners set up tenders, was that the evaluation industry is often used as part of the new public management machinery to defend public spending or legitimise the disposal of programmes that aren't politically popular or they're expensive interventions. And heavyweight philosophers and political theorists have often lamented the kind of burden of science on the social world, and have commented specifically on evaluation. Those include people like Margaret Archer, Hannah Arendt, Arturo Escobar, and our very own Toby Lowe. So today I move straight on to the subject of relationality, with the assumption that we accept the incongruence between the social world and those sort of evaluative orthodoxies of attribution, causation, counterfactuals and those things. And I've noticed that when public service people explicitly foreground relationality in their work, they also foreground it in their public management and evaluative practice. In fact, they seem to think that evaluation work is inherently evaluative. So evaluation is public service, and they're intrinsically linked, and it means that evaluation's purpose is as much about public service as casework is, or governance or procurement. And we see many forms of evaluation dealing with these human relational issues: complex evaluation approaches, participatory, developmental, inquiry-based approaches, realist and other theory-based approaches all serve to make evaluation more human. But when we work with relational practitioners, their relationships they aren't conceived as commissionable or even as interventions. So going and doing theory building work like the realists would do, or building CMO configurations as I would typically have done, didn't feel like the place to start or the direction to take things. So when I was trying to make sense of why the work I was seeing in public service innovation didn't connect well with the forms of evaluation I was used to, I turned to exploring relational evaluation in the literature. And when I was investigating this, the lightning bolt moment for me was when I read the work of Jill and Gergen in their book, Beyond the Tyranny of Testing. And they call for something really different from the fields of evaluation. They were sort of saying that the endeavour to understand the value of education through assessment, so assessing children in schools, in doing that, we actually miss the true value of education altogether, and we actually create suffering because assessment stresses everyone. And they talk about measurement-based systems, meaning schools are losing their capacity to engage students in meaningful learning. So assessment is losing schools' capacity to engage students in meaningful learning. It's a little bit mind-blowing. But they refer to practices, alternative practices like appreciative inquiry, collaboration, reflection, feedback, which I will come back to. And these are applied at all levels of educational evaluation, so from the learning that students actually do through to the performance, evaluating the actual performance of the school. So these practices are part of the inspectorate's approach as well, which is super cool. So to construct what relational evaluation is, I started by deconstructing the term evaluation. So like my dad would have been proud of me, I went back to etymology. So the French and Latin origins of this is action and finding value and being strong or being well. So in understanding relationality, and as someone trained in psychological research, I first went to the theories around intersubjectivity and social ecology. And these stress how individuals are defined by their relationships. So it's sort of the idea that we don't exist individually and then we connect, but rather that connection is inextricable from the human condition. And I think, as well as action and participation, intersubjectivities showing us the importance of understanding. This really sets us up in research terms. So evaluators and researchers must help to build a fundamental understanding of individuals, not aggregated populations, as their primary purpose. Without this, we learn little. It's what the realists would refer to as the human contingent. And the art of understanding in public service is especially brought to life by appreciative inquiry. That was a listening technique that was being used to really good effect and at scale in Plymouth City Council under the guidance of Gary Wallace, and I can see Felix and others from there on here today. And in the Changing Futures Northumbria programme led by Mark Smith, and I see Ron's here today, Ron Charlton's here today as well. They applied the principle of understanding, not assessing, the relational practice as a relational practice with citizens. So this involves focusing on how we understand others and then how with others we make sense out of the world. And interprofessional education people call these processes learning with, from and about each other. So moving on to take up that idea of action from the etymology. We've been using the term action learning a lot, especially with colleagues at Northumbria University, so it comes from the engaged scholarship field. And we've been interested in small actions. We're not always talking about big transformational change. And this idea was picked up beautifully and recently by Carolyn Pedwell at Lancaster University in an excellent talk about habits and revolutionary routines. And she was explaining that the research on habits shows us how sensing and appreciating change in the minor key from Erin Manning's work. We have to think about how we connect with change as it unfolds, how we sense it, how we engage our human capacities for pattern spotting and noticing, and how these involve ongoing attention and awareness. So if valuing work is public service, then pattern spotting, noticing, attention, and the habituation of learning is public practice. So we use the term relational evaluation because of the power of repeated courses of action. That is habituation. It's a definition of practice, actually. So if you go deep with understanding, you can go big with ideas. So depth is a form of scaling when the data are relational. To illustrate this, using an example from Gateshead City Council, they took learning from casework to develop practice, and then they iterated the programme method. And then they went on to develop schemas of drivers deep in the system, and they put a sort of freeze frame around either the status quo or explained what could fuel relational practice. And this is a picture of the measures framework that resulted from that schema, part of Ron and Mark's work. And it was developed bespokely for that work and all from casework. So as an academic, evaluative relationships with public service people has informed knowledge creation and theory in social policy. So we've employed the term learning partnering to refer to sort of mutuality, where the fields of all the participants are advanced, including for us as academics, our academic disciplines. And learning partnering involves convening, which is a space and time orientated piece of work, instigating occasions and environments for sense making. Conversing, which is relationship focused work, and curating, which is data focused work, so secure and boundary objects, representation stories and other data that people could examine together. And our role is not just to judge performance here, but to use these practices to support the development of capacities in the stewardship of purpose, which is the orange bit there, or the coordination of networks of people and resources, which is the green bit, and the adaptations that are based on the received wisdom from those programmes. So in valuing work, The ideas of enactment are critical, and I went to anthropology for guidance here. Storytelling is an ancient human form of relating with, from, and about each other, and that's picked up by Haley and others later. However, it was Lawrence Halprin's work from the 1970s that inspired my thinking most. So Halprin was a polymath, landscape architect, teacher and theorist, and he collaborated with his dancer wife to explore performance in the artistic sense, like theatre, dance, music, those things. It's unfortunate for me, really, because I don't have an artistic bone in my body and it all makes me very uncomfortable. It's very inspiring. So Halprin's RSVP cycles stand for resources, scores, value action, and performance. And when put together, these four elements create cycles of collaboration and improvisation. So you can imagine like actors on a stage performing productions, and their performance is the sort of momentary expression of the score, and it sort of adopts the style of the actors and their unique interactions with each other. And I found this vital in understanding complex work as it plays out in the real world. But what does this teach us, and what does the education literature teach us about valuing relationally? So those scores are symbols or processes of extended work over time. Think of like a musical score, a book is a score, this talk is a score. They're instructions for the work and how it should be carried out. They're processual instructions like methodologies and guidelines. But Halprin said they're not enough. Those things are not enough to produce results. We use our agency to improvise as well. So while we must know the score, literally, so in public service, we listen and learn the stories of others in their context. We also have to use resources and props that are available to us to improvise our practice and our measures, that idea of mensuration. And Halprin used the term value action, which is the process of analysing results in combination with feedback and decisions in action, not decisions based on values determined outside the project. And these can be thought of in the minor key. So when your work is reviewed, you might decide that next time you'll ask questions slightly differently, you'll take different pens to the workshop, you'll take a different route through the park on your next walk with a client, whatever it is. Feedback from what just happened is a massively underrated relational and learning tool, and it's a core capability in relational work. It's pretty apt that the acronym of RSVP is the French for respond. And finally, on this, performance is sort of setting the work in motion in the world, and it takes on its own quality. So in this sense, a performance or a result or an outcome is emergent and somewhat unpredictable, in keeping with complexity approaches. And this teaches us to accept relational outcomes are of the moment. So if an action were repeated, it would be different. It would certainly be different. So more generally in public services, we've noticed the essentiality of people being able to define outcomes in their own terms and in their own context, typically explored and honed through confiding. So it's things like, I want to find work that builds my confidence, is close to home, allows me to care for my mother. It's not, I'll find any job and stay in it for 6 months. So if evaluations are commissioned to evidence outcomes as defined by policy or independently of anyone who experiences those outcomes, it's not relational. Relational outcomes mean giving up the perceived right or control to determine outcomes on behalf of others. Of course, we want crime reduction, we want to prevent ill health, access to better homes, better educational attainment. But these are policy drivers. They're not necessarily the way people would express outcomes in their own lives and through encounters. They're aggregations of perceived value. And ultimately, if we understand outcomes and measures of them in these terms, in relational terms, then they are relative and self-referent, and they cannot be centrally controlled or standardised. So how does all this relate to flourishing and that reference to being strong and being well? Andrew Sayer at Lancaster University is concerned with these things in this book that he wrote about why things matter to people. And he said if we don't know whether people are flourishing or suffering, we know very little about them at all. And he said that if we don't know about those things, then we would have no idea about oppression or freedom, and there would be no striving or struggle for social change at all. So for people and for practice, evaluation must be safe. And ethics is our sort of protective mechanism, isn't it? It's sort of, we've got ethics of care, and that's going to be picked up later as well by other speakers. But it's an interesting question to think about what evaluation can do to nurture us. Thriving is a core concept that refers to the combination of both well-being and performance. So if you think about plants thriving or children thriving, it captures both of those ideas. In evaluation terms, being strong doesn't mean being best. As well as thinking about being strong in contextualised and bespoke outcome terms, we can also think about being strong in our conduct as evaluators and learning partners. And those scores or instructions or methodologies might be considered best when we apply external standards. But we know that when enacted relationally with clients, much more process is created. So in methodological terms, our responsibilities for compassion and care in that emergent process and our account of it, and not our adherence to a standard. And this brings me to my final touchstone, which is our necessary preoccupation with rigour. So rather than the normal quality standards that we're used to, rigour takes on a slightly different expression. So first, the data seem to be conversationally curated, so outcomes are generated through quality conversations. These conversations themselves offer sites of flourishing, care and connection, but crucially are where outcomes can emerge. And data are also contextually credible, so all data are understood with familiarity to the context of each unit of analysis or each life. So it has face validity and is credible as a process. Individuals accept the evidence as part, and the process of gathering it as part of their story. And the data are conceptually, are critically conceptualized. So learning is a strategic intent, and valuers have to make an account of their learning, and the wisdom is internally generated and based on complex context-bound ideas. And these ideas are encouraged through discussion and reflection. So in conclusion, I'm thinking about how these ideas could be used to dismantle or offer rebuttals to the sort of performance productivity myth as it's misapplied to public service. And from a relational perspective, evaluation is public service and it's integral to enacting it. It's a repositioning and repurposing, not necessarily a methodology. It's about habits of understanding and learning with, from and about each other. It's improvising beyond the score, using data and measures to learn, and thinking about responding to outcomes in their context. And it's about taking responsibility for strong, high quality accounts of care in the valuing process. And ultimately, I think relational evaluation can nurture. I was a little bit nervous about giving this talk, but a good and wise friend of mine said, you don't have to get people to like it. You'll have done a good job if what's inside of you gets out. So that's a really worthy evaluative start, and I hope it's start the conversation with you all. So thank you very much.
I think it's my turn now. And I think you did a wonderful job. I just loved your talk about public service and evaluation, and particularly what you ended with. And I think my talk speaks to yours a little bit. I'm going to dive deeper into your strong philosophical concepts, I noticed, but also at the same time very heartfelt. So thank you so much for that. And I loved how you approach evaluation, not just as a methodology, because I would even like to go further. Maybe evaluation can be an approach to living. But before I start, a big thank you to the UK Evaluation Society and to Nick Posford and Nick Andrews for inviting me to join this fascinating panel. And over the next 20 minutes, I will share 3 concepts. So I also decided to structure my talk through different concepts that I've encountered in my work as an evaluator. I started way back in 1996 with responsive evaluation. Then I moved to the field of care ethics. And then at the same time, I was also trained as an artist. So I've always been inspired by the arts and aesthetics, and particularly the emerging field of care aesthetics that is now, developing fascinating things. And the 3 concepts that I'd like to cover are, first, I'll talk a bit about deprivation, then about quality, and the third is more of an invitation, actually, an invitation that aligns, I think, with some of the other speakers of today, and aligns with evaluation as more than mere assessment, as more than negotiation, and even as more than participation, because it positions evaluation as an inquiry into living itself, living together, as care ethicists like to promote, and also honoring the precariousness of that living. And that was already, I think, very, very aptly addressed by the 2 Nicks today earlier, because it has become more and more precarious in this like post-truth time. So bear with me, because I'm just gonna move through some depriving sceneries first before I share a solution. And let me take you to what happened just a few months ago, last November. This is a picture I made, and this is where I spent more than a month. And one day I was sitting next to his bed, and I heard him whisper, something, and at first I couldn't hear it, but he kept on repeating the same sentence over and over. And eventually I was taken aback, because when I understood what it was, he was whispering, "Take me, Lord, thy will be done." And I was taken aback, because he was not religious at all. I covered him with a blanket from the warmer in the hallway, and this was that hallway that you're looking at. And I heard a deep sigh, and his frown relaxed, and my heart pounded. And I thought, are we losing you? And a few hours passed, and he looked to the clock on the wall, and he started to mumble, "2 cousins of mine were visiting me during the night. They were chasing me. Did you see the pictures and bodies and faces? My spoon is full. Can you see the rabbit there? I hear the loons yodeling. Oh, they yodel. Look there, look up." He pointed toward the ceiling tiles. "Look at the leaves. I need to find a way to escape." The clock says 3 o'clock, but it didn't make sense to him. He was confused. And what happened there in that hospital room in Indiana, here in the USA, reminded me of Yuriko Saito's work on care as an ethical and aesthetical practice. And Saito wrote the book, Aesthetics of Care, where she calls for a deep attention to the world and then shows us what happens when attention encounters aesthetic deprivation and the harm it produces. It's a suffering, both aesthetic and moral. It's inseparable. And in November, I was a witness to this suffering. Someone whose mind and spirit I held in high regard was now altered. Of course, this was a form of hospital delirium, as you may have heard. It's a complication of being in a desensitized space like a hospital for too long. Alienation occurs. It's a form of aesthetic deprivation. And did you know that about 88% of the hospital patients admitted to an ICU suffer from a delirium? And about 50% of the people on other wards. I was just flabbergasted by those numbers. Now, aesthetic deprivation and aesthetic injury, as we call it, or just ignoring the impact of our and the value of our aesthetic experiences, they take an almost silent toll. Imagine a world where the familiar becomes distorted, where the comforting becomes chaotic, where perceptual disturbance, as we call it in the field, is harmful. This isn't just a reality of many patients. I think it's a much wider social problem, also in evaluation, and it reflects the deprivation of the relationships we have with the world around us, also as evaluators. Now, we see the very real impact in the world around us, in our natural and built environments too. Here is an example of how it shows up in urban planning. Clearly, this is a space that lacks compassion, lacks connecting with context, and it makes us feel alienated. And as an evaluator and an ethicist, I often wonder how to discern what matters to people during those disorienting and now a post-truth time, when we're struggling to find our footing in a world where the image, the footage, often wins over the facts. Crucial facts are dismissed, particularly here by the media, by others, in a whim. And how can one then have a conversation with others who seem to be living in very different realities? Well, this disconnect, this shared sensibility, a lack of shared sensibility, as the French philosopher, I'm now blank. I have a blank on his name, but it will come to me. He speaks of the aesthetic, political aesthetics, and he argues that the biggest problem in our world is that we lack a shared view of the world. And that is a political aesthetic framing of the challenges that we're dealing about today. Think, for example, about the polarization as a sign of this lack of a shared perceptive sensibility. Or think about when back in 2020, President Trump declared war on ugly architecture, revived on January 20 of this year. It was the presidential action called Promoting Beautiful Federal Civic Architecture, clearly leaning toward classical styles. And this, of course, raised strong concerns among architects and others, like evaluators, about freedom, about artistic freedom, which also counts for academic freedom, diversity, and preference. And to me, it was a very striking and painful example of how political power can be used to impose a particular judgment, a particular value, a particular judgment of beauty and what is right. And that should concern us, as it is about how we evaluate. It revealed how we take action based on quick assessment. And I have a fragment that I borrowed from an old art educator, former art educator, Harry Browdy is his name. Suppose you're in a hotel 10 stories up, and that you heard a commotion, and that you looked out of the window, and that you saw an individual staggering around, bellowing. What would you do? You would call the operator or hotel reception, maybe, warning them that there's a drunk out there. Do something, right? The police may arrive, take them into custody, and peace would be restored. But suppose, before the police came, another individual joined, coming from the wings, and he began dancing in perfect unison with the first person, bellowing in harmony with. Now, what would you do? Whom would you call now? And what's the difference? What happens here? One drunk is a nuisance, two old drunks are being drunk in unison. This is what we call, this is what speaks to the aesthetic experience. Now, this shows that we, as evaluative beings, also quoting Andrew Sayer, and I showed the beautiful cover of his book, this shows that our perception is limited. And it shows that the dancing communicated a different quality than viewing two people moving around as if they were a little too drunk. And the qualities involved influence about 98% of all the judgments we reach about almost anything. We judge not just by fact, but by appearance, by performance, by image. And we base our actions upon that judgment of quality. Qualities direct our very move, our thought, impulses, and it's evident, I think, that it's evident in everybody. Imagine a delicious food or drink or your favorite chocolate bar in front of you right now. Can you feel the quality? You can probably feel it or taste it. You are longing for a chocolate bar if it's out of reach now while you're sitting in front of your computer. Or think about the music that you're drawn to, or the sight of someone that you love, their touch. Now, qualities emerge in the relationships we have with one another too, as evaluators too, in everyday work settings. And in my case, participants in my experience, in my evaluation study may, for example, experience hollowness of care when I look at care, when I try to understand what matters to them in care. Care without quality is hollow, they might say. But for some reason, when I'm attentive to quality as an evaluator, I've experienced that as soon as I try to capture it, it dissolves. It goes haywire. It's very hard to dissolve it. So to actually capture it and share insights with others. So I started to wonder, perhaps quality is not a thing at all. Maybe there would be another approach to working with quality in evaluation. And this shaped my view of evaluation as a living inquiry. In 1996, I began my career as an evaluator of health programs and innovations, and we looked at these programs through different lenses. I wanted to understand their qualities, and clients were often concerned about the goals that were met. And at first, of course, way back, it was about measuring goals, judging, as you all know, and to measure the intended impact of innovation approaches to care, for example, impactful or not. But impact was mostly defined by the ones who paid for the program. And we soon realized this didn't illuminate the quality of a program. Critical things were clouded over, and our question quickly became different. We wondered, what is the firmament of quality? Not just the edges, good or bad, right or wrong, impactful or not, successful or not, but what is the landscape of quality? What's in between there? So we began to meticulously describe practices. What was happening there? We wanted to move closer. What meanings arise when we would speak to people about their programs? And their stories became more central. We learned about what they did to be attentive or to be more patient-centered or responsive to the needs of others, and how difficult that was. So we started being more and more interested in what mattered to them, to their work and in their care. And we assumed that this was not the same as program management would sometimes assume. So evaluation became participation, and it became learning together. But still, something did not feel quite right to me. Yes, we got closer to the landscape of the evaluant. Yes, we listened to people together, and we learned to determine how, who should do what for whom and why and what mattered. But I was still concerned about the approaches that might overshadow or maybe even replace the evaluant or the program being evaluated itself in its own right. And Susan Sontag's famous question kept popping up. She wrote a beautiful essay against interpretation, and she asked, I quote, "What would serve the work, not appropriate its place?" And the answer may be found in an even more radical relationality, I wondered. So what if that landscape of the evaluand is sketched in very gradually, through continuity and through gentleness, as Helen Molesworth put it, in between matter, in between meaning, in between the mountains and the water, some would say, in between relationships with others, with context, nature, the people involved, enriched by theory. Don't misunderstand me. I think theory and concepts have an important place here. Now, I'm going to shift gears once more. And I'm shifting gears toward last fall at my graduate seminar on body studies. I had the pleasure of having Harvard colleague Hisu Kuriyama as a guest lecturer, and he asked us to rethink how we know the body. It's a completely different topic here, through the lens of Chinese medical history. And he showed us how, and me and my students, in contrast to Western approaches, Chinese physicians diagnose diseases as if they are traveling a landscape. And they are curious about the qualities that emerge in the body. And the qualities cannot be predicted in advance, but they can be sensed. He also shared with us how qualities are noticeable. For example, physicians speak about veins and pulses through allegories, through movements and all kinds of imaginations, like this pulse feels like a guitar string, or it is as if small pearls are flowing through my veins. And here one speaks in terms of qualities. So Chinese physicians are trained in that, in how to notice them and discern. And I started to look at the implications of these perceptual and experiential differences in how they traveled the landscape. And I started to wonder, what would it mean if evaluations was as if traveling through a landscape, rhythmical, not static, containing lots of empty spaces, as you can see here, in constant flux. Accurate depiction or description matters too, but revealing the rhythms and the spirit of the evaluand and its qualities are essential. And this isn't just, I think, a difference in how we look or in vocabulary. It's also not just a theoretical concept. It really, to me, speaks about a fundamentally different understanding of the world, an understanding that moves toward being in the world, living in it, as in a process-oriented way. And I believe it has much potential for our work as evaluators. Because what would it mean if we practiced evaluation by living the dynamic interplay of forces within evaluation settings ourselves? It could, if we could be part of the landscape that is sketched in all the while we move through it. We're not just looking at it, we're not detached from it, but we are living off it. And with off, I don't mean detached, but something's coming through because we are embedded and tangled with the evaluand. So in closing, I'll share a final scenery, because there was a moment a few weeks later in the living room, and he said to me, acquiescence contributed to my confusion when I was in the hospital. Acquiescence, I had to look it up, being a Dutch native speaker, stands for a reluctant acceptance, not a consent that he gave, not an approval that he gave, not a rejection either, not a protest, but an acceptance, a receiving of what? And then he added, with a heaviness that was palpable, I gave myself to them. And the words resonated in an almost chilling way. To whom? I asked instinctively. And to them, he said. I gave them the nurses, the physicians, the doctors, while he was in that hospital room. I gave them my agency. By surrendering, he was drawn to the very edge of experience, to, and I quote François Julien, to the limits of the perceptible. A landscape of care became his world, a world that resonated with him like, quote, a bow which played on his soul, end quote. Evaluation takes time, hours stretched into days, then weeks, sitting beside our evaluant. At first, you are observers. You take in the scene, sterile corridors, cold blue lights, a constant hum of machines in desolate hallways, white, almost too white sheets. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, your axis changes. Not in control, you move from being on the lookout, observing, following it, becoming part of it, living it. You become intertwined with the silent currents of change, and it brings a deep understanding of what unfolded. Surrendering to this kind of living inquiry requires a theoretical, perceptual, and poetic flexibility, a willingness to accept what Jan Patočka called the loss of ground, a willingness to let go of certainties and become aware of what constantly flows past our feet, not without precision, not without discernment, but within our relational webs, and acknowledging that as evaluators, we are part of a relational process with limited control. Thank you.
Leanne, I'm in Cardiff University and I am in the second year, heading scarily into the third year of my PhD research. I'm located in Cardiff Business School and I am looking at evaluation and public service reform. And a lot of the things that we're talking about today relate to what I think about my PhD. There's some differences as well. So today I'm going to talk to you about a very early career experience I had, which some of you probably will be able to relate to, which is reflective of subsequent ones I've had and has contributed to the development of my PhD in part. So first of all, I'm going to talk you through the story, then I'm going to share some reflections with you and my subsequent ever-forming PhD research questions. So hopefully you can all see my slides. Here's a story. Some time ago, before the term co-production became very popular, but concepts like empowerment and inclusion and community ownership were being grappled with in the voluntary and public sectors. There was a group of women with Somali heritage who lived in a small but diversely populated South Wales city. They gathered and formed in informal ways for casual but very material reasons, to have practical support with emerging family needs such as weddings and Eid celebrations and funerals and births, to develop and retain connections with other women like them, to reconnect with and express their intersecting identities, and to share life stories and to enjoy friendship and to just connecting with each other by way of food, music, and sometimes dance and laughter. And byproducts of these exchanges were happiness and wellness. At the same time, there was a young professional tasked with developing a rapport with this group and others like them, groups which at the time were understood or classed as minority or hard to reach or challenged or disadvantaged. So the Somali women welcomed this young woman into their fold and enjoyed learning about her role and aims. For this woman's managers and governing bodies to authorise her continued work and interactions with the group, she needed to demonstrate what she was doing that aligned with the Welsh Government programme that she was working under. So that programme and its agenda stipulated that she needed to work with groups to improve specific thematic outcomes, such as the local environment, health and wellness, jobs and business, community safety, and active citizenship. There were expected jobs and tasks she needs to carry out to get closer to these aims, such as capacity building, education, and support with governance. So she worked with very genuine, heartfelt intent to respond to the dynamic needs of the Somali women, but also strategically keeping an eye to the Welsh Government's programmatic agenda. So to address the capacity building element of her role, she talked to the group about becoming formally constituted, which would enable them to become recognised as a formal entity that could attract funding, and they agreed to this. She subsequently supported them to secure funding for English classes, IT classes, and community events. And she also got the women's support to host health awareness events for other women from other minority groups. Initially, the women's group adhered to these asks and accepted the multiple dual narratives that were being created for them, which were, number one, by developing a constitution and attracting funding, they would become a recognised and credible group, which would heighten their happiness and connection opportunities. And her managers accepted that by doing this work, she was attending to the active citizenship element of the agenda. And number two, by improving their community development, English and funding, application skills, the women were heightening their education and career opportunities, and also importantly, they were being able to embolden their voices in official and mainstream spaces. And this is accepted by the women and her managers. And number three, by hosting health awareness events, the women were heightening their chances of remaining well and informed. She advanced on this narrative with her managers by demonstrating how the women were increasing their interactions with mainstream services, therefore improving community coherence or assimilation aims, which sat under the active citizenship dimension of her work. And that's just some examples. There is so much more which could be applied to that group and others. So over time, the young professional noticed that the women's group began to dwindle in numbers and meeting frequency. They didn't turn up to training days. Modest numbers participated in community workshops and activities. And this dwindling continued over the weeks, over the months, over the years, until there remained just one active member. So it may be no surprise to you that the young woman in question was me a long time ago. And I've had some time in that post and since that post to think about what caused that eventual mismatch between the women's agenda and my professional agenda, even though my genuine intent was to centralise their needs while keeping an eye to the official programme priorities. So I observed a couple of gaps relating to the worlds surrounding the development of the outcome priorities. And the first gap related to the women or the community world and the needs that they developed and the content of their needs. So for the women, their needs were about connecting with peers, expressing and validating their multiple identities, you know, being a parent, being Somali, being Black, being a migrant or being a refugee, being a woman, and discharging these experiences in ways that they deemed positive and relevant in safe spaces. I've not been able then to fully relate the needs, the articulated needs of these women with the outcome priorities that were set by the strategic world. I couldn't see a genuine synergy between these needs or a congruent synergy between these needs and the needs that were identified by the women. Their unique and authentic needs were met in rather surface level ways and far-fetched ways. And for me, this brought up questions around depth of understanding and empathy between parties involved in evaluation governance cultures while identifying local or lived needs. How can deep understanding and empathy be developed between people from different worlds? And how can evaluation, design and governance become an opportunity for that empathy to be developed? And how can that be a continuous process, that empathy, not just an initial process? So for example, later on as a social researcher, I've been involved in those initial talks, you know, where the heart of the matter caring conversations I had at the beginning when developing an evaluation, design and theory of change, etc. But then I saw how those heart of the matters sometimes get lost, or quite often actually get lost, in the technicality of evaluation, and then opportunities for that empathy and understanding become reduced. So I'm looking at how we can spot empathy and how we can cultivate it, so that the outcome priorities that are formalised are something that can be authentically resonated with by people with lived experience. And then umbrelling empathy is the subject matter of this conference, which is relationality. I became curious about the work that took place between different worlds when developing these outcome priorities. And for me, that work was a lot about learning. So by the time I was introduced to the group, they had in some way collectively undertaken work to articulate their micro, their local needs. And it was obviously relevant by the amount of enthusiasm and participation in their activities. The WATS programme had also done work to come up with the priorities, but the coming together to do that work hadn't happened. So what didn't happen that I guess I'm reimagining is something connected but also slightly adjacent to the popularised understanding of co-production. I'm gunning for a collective deep learning or discovery journey that takes place between stakeholders from different worlds that can lead to a co-identification or recognition of needs. And like it's been a discovery process that they go on together. And deep learning, when I refer to deep learning, I'm referring to something that's more than surface level, more than words, something that's almost experienced, embodied, to support meaningful and durable change to how things are done. So in summary, my experience and others has made me think about the relational learning process that took place or is missing in evaluation processes, and how that relational learning process can contribute to empathy and empathic understanding between different worlds when identifying and articulating evaluation priorities or needs. So my theoretical and pretty practical interest lies in these things. I'm sorry about that. I'm interested in evaluation worlds and institutions in which evaluation is created and how different worlds interact with each other. I'm interested in people from different worlds and how they interact with each other, and power dynamics and relationship dynamics. And importantly also, I'm interested in the relationship between people as agents and the worlds that they inhabit. So the worlds that they're working in, but also the worlds they're working with and across as well. And I'm interested in the world of discourse, or AKA communication, as something that can shape how evaluation is done, and how it's also shaped by existing norms and cultures. So I'm interested in the powerful opportunities we have as humans to reshape how we think and do evaluation. But also I'm trying to pay respect to the enduring and stubborn preconditions that can get in the way of change attached to worlds, and how those stubborn preconditions can be negotiated with gradually through discourse. So this is beginning to take shape in my PhD research. My main aim is using evaluation governance as a relational learning opportunity. I'm looking at the discursive conditions that support empathic and reflective evaluation cultures. At the moment, as they stand, this is materialised in 3 questions. Number 1, what are the current cultures and values shaping how evaluation or performance is measured? What discursive context or discursive/structural contexts and circumstances support change in these values? And those values I'm talking about are thinking more about empathy and underscoring that we're trying to understand each other when we're doing evaluation. It's not just about testing things, it's about us building some type of dynamic with each other. And that being part of a learning journey. I'm interested in the platforms that are already in place or that might be being developed to support formal and informal interactions. So that's, in other words, discursive action is supporting this change. So I'm hoping in a modest way that by asking these questions that we can get closer to addressing those frustrations and help us to move a little bit more from talking about relational evaluation to doing it. So that's it for me. Those are my contact details. Slides will be shared later on as well. I'm going to hand over to you, Peter, now.
Thank you, Leanne, for that lovely story. And it just strikes me as slightly weird that this organisation employs you. You learn all sorts of things and are sensitive to all sorts of things, and then they aren't really allowed to happen. I mean, what, you know, you could ask yourself, why does that go on? I think that's perhaps one of the things that may be revealed in what I've got to say, when I'm going to try and link up with some of the issues that you've been raising through some themes from my perspective.
Just stopping the clock.
Can you hear me all right?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was going to say to try and link up from my perspective as a service user survivor researcher, drawing on that experience and through my involvement in Shaping Our Lives, which is a national disabled people's organisation. But you've really reminded me, Leanne, of the commonalities that there are between people as workers and people on the receiving end of services, and we should not forget that in this conversation. We in Shaping Our Lives are committed to user involvement in research and evaluation and practice, building equal relationships and collaborating with others. And we've long highlighted as key what we call inclusive involvement. That's to say, involving in action and knowledge development everyone's contributions and insights, challenging barriers, discriminations and exclusions, which of course is rather more difficult to do than it is to say. There are some big issues at work here, and as Leanne has seen, underlying the kind of everyday experiences and realities that she's reported in what she's said. And I think it's really helpful as we can today to surface these if we're going to challenge their consequences and strengthen the opportunities for the kind of relational, experiential and co-produced inquiry which we are talking about here. Truth is, though, that when we talk of taking forward a more equal, participatory, relational approach to evaluation and knowledge development, we know, we've been hearing, taking on a big task. It's a radically different paradigm to the past. It makes new demands on all of us, even if, to my mind, it's the only way forward to build truly inclusive policy practice and understanding. So we need to be clear about what we're doing and taking on. That's why it's so important we're having this opportunity. Building clarity and consensus, advancing debate, challenging each other to make what I think is a brilliant leap. It is challenging, and we are mounting a challenge to the past. We need to get this clear so we can most successfully take this task forward. So let me go through some of the things that I think may be involved. First, if we want to develop more equal inclusive knowledge, then we need to interrogate traditional Western understandings of science and what we should value in knowledge and evidence production. I find it interesting that the reactionary politics we're experiencing reject both traditional science and the understandings we get from lived experience, a frightening situation. Since the 18th century Enlightenment, there's been an emphasis, though, on experiment as the basis for so-called reason and knowledge that's been based on the positivist values which we have trotted out before us of neutrality, objectivity and distance, which of course sounds very reasonable, except of course those victimized by oppression and discrimination, and that means notably on grounds of ethnicity, colonialism, gender, sexuality, class and disability, who might want to tell their story, could never claim these three things. They would be taken to represent the opposite, bias, closeness and subjectivity, because they've been through the mixer, facing the barriers, which tends actually to end up meaning that their knowledge from first-hand experience is devalued. And what I feel happens is that they are then doubly discriminated against, because their validity as knowers is marginalized, as they themselves sadly often are. I think we must treat their standpoints and the evidence from their individual and collective experiential knowledge and self-led research as having its own validity, and develop not only a relational approach, but equal relations with them, their understandings and their experience to gain the benefits that these can grant us and our knowing. In so doing, we must take all steps to engage with all such viewpoints and the intersections there may be with them. Few of us, we know, have one monolithic identity. If we are, as I believe we should, to seek inclusive and complete pictures and understandings, we need the contribution and involvement of all on equal terms. We should also reflect on our own experiential knowledge, as I think Leanne has done, our own experience through work and its limitations, but also of discrimination, our own practice wisdom, as we've been hearing about it, as both workers and researchers, as well as what we may call our learned expertise for the insights they can offer us as knowers and workers too. We shouldn't see what's come to be called lived experience as merely individual storytelling or anecdotes, but as a starting point. As we're showing and seeing, it can be developing collective understandings as a basis for different understandings of research, evaluation, as disabled people and other service users have shown and done. As mainstream researchers, practitioners and policymakers, I think it's important we try to familiarise ourselves with the growing and helpful traditions of knowledge creation through emancipatory disability research, user-led research, survivor research, feminist, Black and Indigenous research to gain better understanding of their principles, the principles they are based on, to strengthen our appreciation and capacity for building the more equal and inclusive research relations they highlight, and generally to build on, share and benefit from what's already been achieved. We must make sure that they help transform, we make it possible for them to transform our research and evaluation learning, as well as our own individual understanding. We need to build more equal alliances. That's for me so important with them. The organisations of these constituencies as part of the process of transforming many minorities to be the majority that we actually are. We can see ourselves as committed to processes and objectives that are concerned with inclusion, diversity and equality, with supporting social justice and empowerment at personal and political level. That's our great possibility, and I think today is an example of how we're seeking hard to take it forward. Thanks very much.
So Hayley, I'm going to introduce myself and then I'll hand over to you, and then we'll explain what we hope that you will experience by the end of our presentation. And the major part of the session is trying to get you to practice some of our process or methodology. So I'm Isaac. I led on this particular piece of work and I do lots of stuff in co-production spaces, but I'm really passionate about this power of storytelling to create change. Hayley, can I invite you in?
Yep, I'm Hayley. I'm a researcher that works with participatory methods, mainly storytelling and different creative techniques, all trying to create spaces where voices that are often unheard or overlooked can be heard and included equitably within research and evaluation settings. And I'll click to the next slide. Oh, it's not letting... There we go.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hayley. So the conversation that we're hoping to have today is really about exploring the work that we've done around peer-to-peer storytelling grounded in lived experience. And we've already heard from other people on the call today the importance of lived experience and how you can use kind of tools for relational evaluation, such as lived experience and peer-led storytelling. So drawing upon and examining racism within co-production spaces, highlighting dialogue, interviews, and then covering uncomfortable truths that can often find it really difficult to surface in traditional kind of processes, and challenging dominant narratives, and you'll hear this throughout our presentation, and making a case for storytelling to being something that can be used for social justice and for good, and has a real-world application or real-world kind of change for people. Thank you. So, Understanding Anti-Racism in Co-Production Spaces. This title was developed by the people that we asked to share their stories. And the relational aspect of this starts way before this project was conceived. It starts with mine and Hayley's relationship, with the relationship I had with people that do co-production that told me that their experiences weren't the same as their white peers, and whiteness was being preserved in co-production spaces. And I want to honour and respect somebody who's not here today, Sam, who isn't here today, who held me through the journey. And the journey was one that was meant to have taken about 6 months. It ended up being a year-long project because it came at a particular time and place, and there was lots of things that happened. So the goal was to amplify the racialized voice or racialized people's experiences in co-production by gathering and developing a safe environment for people to share their narratives and stories, to actively create a space where anti-racism was an experience that people could really use to create more equitable co-production spaces. It really invited people to share their stories from a wide range of backgrounds. So we focused on the global majority, but we really wanted to hear from people that were easily ignored in other spaces or underrepresented in kind of the discourse around anti-racism. Thank you. So our storytelling approach and community reporting, please do use this. I think it's a fantastic approach, and talking about that relational aspect. So I truly believe that we should never ask anyone to share our story unless we're prepared to share our stories. Community reporting is a digital storytelling methodology or tool that can be used to support and elevate people's lived experiences. This can be done in a variety of ways. So it might be conversations like we're having right now, might be through audio, pictures, and really thinking about, people should tell stories in a variety of ways. So there is 3 distinct kind of processes or stages within our community reporting cycle. One is gathering stories or probing, voicing things that matter to people. In this context, it was certainly around their experiences of being racialized individuals or being individuals with intersecting identities, and how they experience co-production spaces. That experience really helped us then really think about how we wanted to make sense of these stories. And we talk about story creation and how we change perceptions as the result of like how we might organize them. And we invite people that have shared their stories to help us make sense of those stories, help us look at the deeper meanings, and really help us identify the themes that they wish to carry forward into the mobilization phase. And that's really like kind of wonky words, but really how do we bring the stories to create real change in the world based on what people tell us? So we're not assuming, we're using lived experience to lead us through and guide us through the process. So calling for stories and contributions, organizing and looking at deeper meanings, and using those to create real world change. So the process that we use, and these are called dialogue interviews. It's really interesting. They're called interviews. I think of them as dialogue conversations. I'm someone with lived experience of not only racism, but also as someone that's actively involved in co-production. These interviews help us really connect. And they are conversations, and very broad conversations. The conversations should be directed by the person sharing their story, and be mindful like the power dynamics and how we bring our own things into the space. The community reporter, in this instance was myself, really should be facilitating a conversation that leads to people really sharing their story in a way that makes them stronger. It's about being open, starting with really kind of broad questions where points of connection can be made, actively listening and responding, following where the storyteller will lead you and being responsive to the storyteller's needs, being really trauma responsive, so really being attuned to kind of what comes up in that space, not shying away from that, but being much more inquisitive, being really open to kind of questioning your own assumptions and biases and where it leads you to, but really centering the individual within the dialogue interview process. When conversations lead you to these spaces, I think much more richer insights and knowledges are gained, and actually they have real world applications. Cool. So what did we learn as a result of taking this approach? So I was told very early on in my co-production journey that many people were having this experience. I was also told by many people that this was anecdotal. There wasn't evidence to suggest that people were having these experiences of racism. So we did something about it. We used lived experience research myself to really capture those stories, to create a different discourse within co-production spaces and create some challenge back to co-production spaces. And what we learned is there was a need to understand racism and the historical legacy of racism. There was certainly a prevailing sense and experience of the fear of calling out racism, and people then being told that their experiences weren't true or they were misinterpreting. And the term that was often used was gaslighting. There was tokenism or appropriation. So tokenism that we needed one black person because we needed this particular project or co-production piece to be diverse. So we would need one black person, we would need a gay person, we'd need etc. And appropriation of knowledge and ideas. So people often talked about sharing their ideas in spaces and it being overlooked or being used or in an appropriate way. So they might share their idea, it not be heard, but a white colleague or peer would say the same thing and that would be heard and then adopted as their idea. Overt and covert racism. And this really manifested itself during this particular project or this particular trying to change things in the world as the riots happened at the same time when we were doing this, and people talked about how overt racism, elitism and exclusionism, how co-production spaces often felt like they were difficult to enter as racialized people or difficult to kind of lead and facilitate, and that people were actively excluded, that we couldn't just talk about our experiences, that we needed people to do something. So there was an urge and a desire for an urgent call for change, embracing equity in terms of contribution, ensuring people were rewarded and remunerated, and that they had being, credited for kind of the knowledge that they brought, facilitating challenging discussions or discourse was really important, and how people felt that wasn't something that currently happened in co-production spaces. And ensuring equitable compensation and payment was something that people talked about were the totality of their experiences within these co-production spaces as global majority individuals. So where did that lead us? So here is an example of some of the work, and we wanted to showcase it. And then we want you to kind of just think about how you connect with it and what are the key themes and messages coming out whilst listening to this.
Sometimes we can only co-produce when we have these very hard conversations, but we need to have it because we acknowledge that systemically these injustices exist, and it's not always going to be a very easy conversation to have. But I think that it takes a lot of preparation. We should be prepared to come into that space and believing that everyone has something to share. And quite often in such spaces, I also find that some people might need a little bit of support, but over time, the lived experience became a performance of trauma. So we need somebody who's Black, African. It's even better if they are disabled. Let's just find out if they are a member of the LGBTQ, so they can come and perform their trauma, and then they can go. And when we are looking for people to hire, we can say that we want people with lived experience, and we can even mention that intersection we want, but not acknowledging that perhaps as an organization, and we've realized that for so long we have been doing this thing a certain way, and now we have seen that we want a change quite radical, that we want these people to come in here and offer.
So that's just an example of the work that we do, and we would invite people to maybe watch some back some of the clips, or be in a discussion and help us figure out the deeper meaning and the things that we might want to privilege in terms of kind of people's experiences. So Hayley, can I have the next? Thanks so much. So not only did we launch this report and we have a really solid base, solid group of stories or collective of stories, we launched the report in February, and we continue to use the report and the insights from these lived experiences to create like real world change. There's been over 1,500 interactions with the videos, and we will continue to promote them. There's been like learning opportunities with organizations. We have amplified a program where we're supporting global majority individuals to become community reporters, and this is called Amplifying Voices. We initially wanted 10 individuals, and we had over 70 applied, and we've managed to train 10 individuals that wouldn't have the opportunity to, go onto a training program because of access needs and some of the barriers, and then work with a wider group of people online. And that's been great, because not only does it enable us to move the work forward, it means that our community reporting methodology is much more diverse. Now we move into developing a comprehensive training module with the Impact Centre, the Co-Production Collective and partners, amongst other things. And what we're being led by is the stories, and through the process we will continue to be led by the stories. And how does this connect to the topic of today's gathering? So storytelling as a relational practice. So storytelling approaches and community reporting particularly focuses on gathering insights through connections. I shared my story. I started off sharing my story, then became a community reporter, then started to lead projects, and you can see the relational aspect of that throughout. It helps us connect to space and time and ideas, but lived experiences. It tells us about the things that we need to pay attention to. So it helps us build trust and deeper connection. It helps us share our knowledge and feelings. It helps us stay grounded in the work when the work is particularly painful. And it creates a shared understanding to be brave and to challenge and to change the status quo in the world. This was particularly around being anti-racist. And it helps us really understand what needs to change from the individual's perspective, not an assumed perspective, which often happens in other spaces. And the methodology, I believe, enabled us to really connect beyond the traditional way of kind of connecting. So, Hayley, I believe I'm going to hand over to you.
Yep, thank you, Isaac. So, as Isaac said, for storytelling to be relational, then us as researchers, facilitators, evaluators, then we should share our stories too. So what we have got now in our short session is a space where you can share your experiences with others on this call, and we're adopting an approach to storytelling that emerged with us, and Camarados led it, and we kind of adapted it with community reporting when the pandemic hit, and we all went from previously doing a lot of in-person things to exploring and having storytelling spaces online. So it's a spoon room format that we're going to be adopting. So in a moment, we'll be popped into some small breakout rooms, and everyone will have some time to reflect on the question. And before we go into the breakout rooms, Nick, I will post the question into the chat as well, so it goes with people. So the question is, think about an issue or a topic that is important to you and or your community, however you perceive your community. And think about how has your lived experience shaped your view and understanding of that. Okay, and you can interpret that question in any way that you want to, and reflect on it in any way that kind of just comes to you now in the moment. Once you're in the breakout room, if you allocate one person to be a timekeeper, but they should also participate too, so someone has to wear a couple of hats. And each person has at least 2 minutes to respond to these questions. You may get some further time if your group's a bit smaller than the other groups, but if we say 2 minutes, we know everyone gets at least an initial response in. And during those 2 minutes, you can share your experiences about how your lived experiences shaped an understanding of a topic or an issue. The rest of the group should listen without responding, even if that person doesn't talk. This is really about active listening. So even if there is a silence in those 2 minutes, our people only take 30 seconds to share what they want to say. For the other 90 seconds, please do just stay there. Don't interrupt or interject. If you're like me and you struggle with that, or you struggle not interacting with people, nod. Make eye contact as good as you can on Zoom with people and show that you're there with them listening. So indicate active listening. Those 2 minutes are there for the storyteller to use in whatever way they want to. And then if there's any time remaining, and you may have that in your group, you might take a few moments to notice how sharing your own understandings of your own lived experience made you feel. Was it a positive experience, or was it quite daunting sharing that lived experience with people you might have only just met in the last second or so? How was what shared connected to one another? Did other people have similar experiences or understandings as yourself, or were they very different? If there is time and you want to, you might share these reflections and chat amongst yourselves about them. So the purpose of this activity is to give you a space to share experiences, but also to understand experientially what it's like to share a story or share an experience. Because often those of us maybe who might classify ourselves or position ourselves on the evaluation, research, facilitator, professional side, we don't often think too much about sharing our own stories or what that is actually like within a session. So it kind of gives us some time to reflect on that. So I'll just stop sharing there. Thank you, Isaac. I can see that you've popped the question in the chat already. So Nick, I think we're good to go. Am I right in thinking the breakout rooms are happening? I'm not used to not being in control of the tech.
No, it's all right.
Yeah.
My control freak nature kicked in then. Is it happening?
Yeah. No, don't worry.
Hopefully you're all back with us and you found at least one person in your room to have a conversation with and share some experiences with. So just to wrap up before we might take some comments or questions from people, we kind of had some key takeaways to leave you with. So I guess probably what we've also been looking at today in different ways is how knowledge hierarchies exist. Scientific knowledge or certain types of data or insights are often privileged over lived experience. And I think, Hannah, you might have touched upon, debates around rigor in these processes and, what's rigor, what's academic rigor, what's all of these things we kind of come back to. But I guess what we would kind of position is that it's not one or the other, but all are equally valued and valid in terms of types of knowledge, and together they kind of create a much more nuanced and flourishing picture and aid our understanding. And I guess conventional research practices can often exclude experiential knowledge, or at the very least, they're not necessarily the most effective tool to gaining the knowledge. So if you think of just standard interviews where you have a predetermined list of questions and you're meant to ask the same questions to each person. You only ever get the answers to the questions that you're asking. Whereas if you have a conversation or engage people in storytelling, you might find out things that you didn't know you needed to know. So then you would have never asked a question about. And it's in those kind of challenging of perceptions and perspectives that Isaac drew upon earlier, where those really nuggets of human understanding and kind of perspective shifting things really come from. So what we'd like you to contemplate, and we'll pop these into the chat, both now and as we kind of go on our relational evaluation practice journeys, are some questions. So how can relational approaches to evaluation, such as peer-to-peer storytelling, help to overcome some of the issues around knowledge hierarchies and around different ways of knowing and different perspectives not being as valued as others? Now, can we flip that table completely? How can we change our approaches to evaluation so that we avoid extracting insights and instead build, as Leanne was talking about, those spaces that are trust and co-learning spaces? And also, what specifically will you do? So what one action are you going to take away to support the inclusion and amplification of unheard or marginalised voices in your own work? And this could be simply sharing the Padlet with people in your team or who you work with, sharing a resource from today. Go and having a conversation with someone in your team about something that struck you from today. So what's the one action that you're going to do? And if you want to share those in the chat or indeed come in and start a conversation about some of these ideas, then that would be great. I think we'll end there, and I'll share the links that I said I would share. Let me just escape out of those slides. Just pop the questions in the chat and the links to the community reporting method, the website, and also the project that Isaac and Sam led, where you can find out more about that. They're also on the Padlet. So yeah, if anyone has any comments, questions, or anything they want to mention before we go into the wrap up of the event, then this is your space to use as you would like.
I can see, looks like there's a couple of comments about how thought-provoking it's been, which I think is definitely true. I'm interested from your perspective as practitioners. Did you find that, because it feels like this is if I can put it in these terms, you have much less control. You kind of give up control, and that's part of the point of what you're doing, is that it's not, I guess, in some respects, traditional evaluation is sort of, can often feel like a bit of a top-down process, whereas this feels much more bottom-up. How did you feel about that, and how was it as a practitioner?
So I'll jump in. So first, Hayley, if that's okay. So I never really wanted any control. So the motivations for doing the work was the relationship I had with people's experiences. But what I realised is that actually to do the work in co-production spaces, we needed to present them in a particular way, and there needed to be some way of sharing the insights. And I think that myself and Hayley and the people that came together to do that really led to kind of the creation of the report. And I think like using many different approaches leads to challenging your own way of working. So I've learned some things, I've learned not to do some things, and I think for me it was never about control, but it's very easy to get very passionate about something you love and care about, and it's now having a life of its own, so I've had to let go in some way. Hayley, what about you?
Yeah, so thinking about lived experience storytelling, like bottom-up approaches to evaluation in more general, because this is not my work. This is Isaac and Sam's work who led and delivered this. Yeah, that challenge comes back to me when I go, oh, let's do some storytelling, and people want to control the boundaries of the storytelling. So it's like, right, make sure we find out this. And it sort of misses the point of storytelling. If you're going to just want to find out those information, just send a couple of survey questions out to something and, be done with it. And I think what I've found in the work and using community reporting in a range of settings and lived experience storytelling is that you can't win that argument without people experiencing it. So all we ever tried to do, we've tried to do at PVM is to get organisations or teams to enable us to try to work with lived experience storytelling to start the process. Because I don't think if someone's of the mindset of, we need to find out this specific information, you're not going to win it just by having, an academic or a kind of methodological discussion. What happens is people experience it, i.e. we bring people along a journey, we train them as community reporters, they gather stories, they share their stories, we look at them together. And within that experience of working with the stories, they see the value of it for what they're trying to do. But it's a slow burner and it takes time, but so the battle is not to get them to buy it in the sense of buy into it. The battle is to get them to let you try it with them and bring them on that journey. And once you've done that, that's what I find is where people really get it. And, where it goes, I think as we titled this, from concept to practice. Conceptually, you just have to intrigue them enough to get you to try it in practice. And then through the practice of it is where the understanding comes.